Hello, everybody. My name is Cameron McConnell, and I'm going to be talking about React.js today. First, we're going to start off with an introduction to React.js. What is React.js? React is an open source JavaScript framework developed by Meta, Facebook, for building interactive and dynamic single-page application. React combines HTML and JavaScript, titled JSX, into one package for seamless front-end development. Why use React.js? Well, it's on the left here, we can see an example of vanilla JavaScript with vanilla HTML. In combination, we can see that there is a division between the two, and the JavaScript requires us to do a lot of extra steps and using methods and functions from JavaScript that are just very nasty and just overall very cluttered. And on the right, we can see an example of React that just overall simplifies everything with JSX, and we can just immediately do what we need to do without having to use a lot of the hassle from regular HTML and JavaScript. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of React.js. So created by a software developer or software engineer at Meta, Jordan Walk, the prototype was originally called Facts.js. It was first deployed on Facebook's newsfeed in 2011 and later to Instagram in 2012. And finally, it was open sourced at JavaScript Conference in 2013. Next, we're going to be getting into some of the technical details. So how does React.js work? HTML is structured as a tree. This is called Document Object Model, or DOM. And React builds a virtual DOM in memory that represents the UI. When the UI changes, React builds a new virtual DOM and compares it to the old one. React then goes about converting the old DOM to the new one with the fewest steps possible. This process is called reconciliation. Next, we're going to be talking about static sites versus client-side rendering. And this is one of the bigger benefits that React offers over vanilla JavaScript and HTML. So the biggest difference is how they are implemented on web servers. The JavaScript and HTML are requested from a web server and sent to a client for static sites. This requires multiple requests to the web server when you have a multi-page application. The benefit of React over vanilla is that it uses a client-side and server-side rendering approach. To begin, React will compile all of your code and convert it to JavaScript. This will happen on the server when a user requests the URL. When the server sends the JavaScript code to the client and the client takes over, then the client takes over the rendering for the JavaScript from there. This reduces the request to the web server, but at the cost of greater computation requirements placed on the server and the client. Next, we have React.js components, which are the building block of everything React related. React components are reusable pieces of React code that are used for building UI elements. This allows for compartmentalization of code, less work, and complex and reactive UIs. Components in React are either class-based or functional. Functional components are the most recent and used most frequently. Next, at the bottom, on the bottom left, we can see an example of a class-based component, and the right, we can see a functional component that I wrote myself. Next, we'll be talking about React.js props. Props are values passed from parent to child components. This allows for parent components to update child components when specific values have been changed. For example, say a parent component renders a child component after a fetch request to the backend for a username. The parent component can then render the child and pass the username as a prop to the child component, or it can be used as a variable in what it renders. And this can be a header, a paragraph, or anything that has the username embedded within the JSX or the HTML JavaScript combination. And you can see at the bottom, I have some examples of props that I've defined using TypeScript, and it's code that I've written myself for some projects. Next, we'll be talking about React.js hooks. React contains functional pieces of code that are used to update the virtual DOM, primarily when the values of variables are changed. The most common hooks will be discussed in the next few sections, as well as there are also hooks that offer more utilities, but we're just going to be covering the most useful or the most used ones in this discussion. So first off, we have useState. useState is a React hook that ties the updating of the virtual DOM to the change of a variable. For example, say I tie a username variable to a useState hook and use this in a header tag within a component. When the value of this variable is changed, React will re-render the component with the new value of the variable. In the bottom left, we get an example where it updates the count value and will re-render this new value of the count. And on the right, we can see some examples of useState that I've defined in a project of mine using TypeScript. Next, we have useEffect. UseEffect is a hook that will be executed on render of a component, and if a specific value tied to the useEffect is changed. An example of useEffect would be to render a loading screen while you wait for a fetch request to finish processing. Once the fetch request is processed, you can render the main component or JSX you wish to display. And we have an example of that in the bottom left and in the bottom right, where it's a piece of code that I've written myself. So some final thoughts on React. Why I think you should use React.js. React has a large ecosystem and digital footprint. The open source nature of React allows not only open communication between developers, but fosters a culture around developing components and libraries that are useful for all. Normally, other frameworks require a lot of ground-up development, but since React has such an active community, much of your time is saved using open source code. React may have a large learning curve, but for some, but once you start, you'll probably swear by how great React is and never turn your back to vanilla web development practices. In conclusion, if you're just starting out on your web development journey, it is most important to have a good foundation and understanding of web development technologies like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript before you start learning front-end frameworks like React. Once you do have a great foundation, you may want to learn some simpler frameworks like Svelte and then move on to React. As one of the most in-demand skills of software development, it could be a great idea to get some experience with this tech. Thank you for your time, and here are my references for where I got the information.